Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you a close look at the image quality from the new Kamlan 28mm f1.4. Surprisingly, on a lot of levels, this lens actually punches quite a bit above its weight. And I've noted, since I had the opportunity to review an earlier lens from this very new optical company, the 50mm f1.1 that I reviewed last year, I've noted a lot of maturation in just the 6 months or so since that lens, and that this new 28mm f1.4, it solves a lot of the optical shortcomings of the 50mm f1.1. And so I'm going to jump in and give you a breakdown and look at a whole range of metrics of image quality performance, and so you can decide for yourself if this budget prime is a lens that is worth shooting with. Let's jump in, let's look at some images. I'm going to start off this image quality examination by doing a quick comparison with the Sigma 30mm f1.4 DN lens. Now the Sigma, of course, is an autofocusing lens. It also costs more than twice as much as the Kamlan. But here on a Sony E-mount APS-C, it is the closest comparison that I can make. So globally, let's look at a couple of things. First of all, you can see that the Kamlan has noticeably less barrel distortion than what does the Sigma. The Sigma is fairly prone towards barrel distortion. It's hard to make a judgment when it comes to vignette, as the Sigma has an embedded profile. The camera embeds the profile for the lens and the raw file, whereas with the Kamlan, because there is no built-in profile due to no electronic connection and no ability for the camera to know what lens is there, it is not automatically corrected. So what I've done is I have built my own profile correction. So let me quickly detail for you what's involved in this profile. And so you can see that I have added a value of 6 into the distortion correction, and that really is enough to pretty much straighten out all the lines. You could correct it just probably a hair further, maybe a 7, but this is achieving pretty nice straight results. And then vignette, this is at f1.4, and so it's going to be, of course, aperture specific. Smaller apertures are going to need less vignette correction. But here I have a kind of a moderate value of 43 with a midpoint of 17. Now, as we look at this image as a whole, it does seem like the light transmission is a little bit brighter, but it's hard to know how much of that is kind of electronic correction. We can see that even at our center result here, we do have a slightly brighter result from the Sigma. And so, of course, you know, we're working with exact same aperture values, so maybe a little bit better light transmission, but it is kind of hard to divorce pure image quality from the electronics with some of these Sony comparisons. And so, you know, in a lot of cases, we're working with, you know, apples to apples, and that both of them have had some correction applied, but that's not the case here. What we find is at f1.4, you can see in the center of the frame that it looks like to be a little bit more contrast that is there for the Kamlan in the center of the frame. Resolution wise, they are similar, but I would give an edge to the Kamlan, and part of that, what you're seeing here is the fact that there is more of a veiled look on the Sigma. It's not just that it's brighter here, but you can see there is some kind of purple fringing along these edges, which is why I like to use this particular wall for comparison, as all these things show up, unlike a test chart, which is two-dimensional. So here you can see part of the reason why there is some veiling on the center result on the Sigma, and that's because there is a little bit more axial chromatic aberration that's there that will clear up as we stop down. Now, if we look towards the edge of the frame, however, the Sigma advantage, or the advantage shifts to where really the Sigma is showing a little bit more resolution. The Kamlan edge result almost has a little bit of a kind of a nervous quality, as if it's not fully resolving. And I did test to see if this is field of curvature. I did another series where I shot focusing on the edge rather than the center. And while there is a very, very, very mild improvement, it's pretty much the same story. And so this is not so much field curvature as it is just, you know, lower resolution along the edge of the frame. Now we can see, looking at f2, that our kind of exposure values are a little bit more equalized here. The Kamlan still looks better globally in terms of the contrast of the image. The other thing I do want to point out is that I think that the Kamlan, again, I test a lot of lenses and I use this wall quite often, at least in the last 9 months since I've had access to it. And so as a result, I have become pretty familiar with what the color temperature of this wall should be. As a result, I can tell you that the Kamlan is doing a more Zeiss-like type job of color accuracy here. And I noted just in general shooting that color accuracy is surprisingly fantastic for such an inexpensive optic. You can see that the Sigma result is a little bit warmer by comparison and just ever so slightly skewed towards a little bit of a green/yellow cast there. Now, jumping in and looking at in detail, we see now that I would say that the Sigma and the Kamlan result in the center is it's more similar than different in terms of resolution. Contrast still very slightly favors that of the Kamlan. But if we move off to the edge, the Kamlan has improved a little bit, and it's not terrible out here now. It's a little less nervous looking, but we have seen that the Sigma has improved more so. So the Sigma is looking just a little bit soft here on the edge, but as you noted, looking in the center, those chromatic aberrations have started to clear up. It's still some evidence of it there. But as a result of that, the resolution profile and contrast is extending a little bit further out than what it does with the Kamlan. And if we move out into this area here, you can see that already still there's some advantage for the the Sigma as you get off of center. Now at f2.8, looking at images globally, again, other than the color temperature and color accuracy difference, now the contrast is looking more similar than different, and in a lot of ways the Sigma has reached its peak sharpness here at f2.8. Particularly in the center, it looks very good in the center, and now it looks a little bit better in the center than what the Kamlan does. Towards the edge of the frame, it still does look better, I would say, at this point. And so at f2.8, Kamlan has not peaked in sharpness, the Sigma has, and so this is a very strong point for the Sigma. Now, it's worth noting that throughout this sequence, even though the Kamlan has a clickless, stepless aperture, you can see that its aperture markings have lined up correctly in that all throughout the series, even though I was using AV mode for shooting these, the aperture or not so much aperture, I should say, the exposure value lined up perfectly. At f4, once again, the Sigma is looking stronger in the center of the frame than what does the Kamlan. Off towards the edge of the frame, however, we see the situation is now reversing and that the Kamlan is looking stronger towards the edge of the frame. Now, if we move on down to kind of traditional like f5.6 apertures, still a bit of an edge in the center of the frame for the Sigma. At the edge of the frame, though, there's no question the Kamlan is actually just fantastic now at the edge of the frame. And so as far as a landscape shooting lens, the Kamlan is actually the better choice of the two at landscape apertures, because you can see contrast and sharpness is just rocking it here on the Kamlan, whereas the Sigma has not really improved out on the edges beyond a certain point. At an aperture of f8, we see that now the Kamlan looks just as good in the center, better contrast, and pretty much equal resolution. At the edge of the frame, however, the Kamlan looks really consistently fantastic, and so better contrast, better sharpness. And so again, there's some give and take between these lenses. It really depends on how you shoot them. And so wide open, the center sharpness and contrast on the Kamlan is actually better, but edge performance favors the Sigma. The Sigma peaks at around f2.8 with consistency across the frame, and then when you get down past f8, edge performance actually favors the Kamlan, and it gives the more consistent result across the frame. Now, in real-world shooting, even by about f2, which I believe was the aperture for this, in real-world shooting, you can see that it delivers a really, really beautiful result. And so on our plane of focus here, resolution, contrast, and color rendition, all of those things are really fantastic. And this is a beautiful image that looks like it came off of a much, much more expensive lens than one that cost $159. Now, in this particular image here, unlike the 50mm f1.1, it did not handle high contrast scenes very well at all, whether the sun was in the frame or not. In this case, sun is not directly in the frame, but we do have, as you can see, a lot of backlighting and a lot of light value to begin with. So, in other words, we have a very high contrast scene. You can see on a global level, the Kamlan is actually rendering this beautifully. Colors look fantastic. The handling of light is very good. And we see that here, even at f1.4 here, or very close to it, maybe f1.6, 1.8, somewhere in that range, that there are only minimal amounts, even in this very high contrast area, there are only minimal amounts of chromatic aberration, just a little bit of purple fringing there. And so as a result, we can see that it's able to handle these higher contrast situations without falling apart. And I like the fact that there is not a lot of bleeding along these edges. Edges look nice and crisp, and that to me is an impressive result for this kind of lighting situation for such a inexpensive optic. We can also see just in this kind of setup that is particularly for detecting, not only chromatic aberrations on our plane of focus, and so you can see just the most minor amount of purple fringing before the plane of focus, and just trace amounts of green fringing after the plane of focus. This is at f1.4, but all in all, we've gotten really a strong result. And then if we look at our, these bokeh highlights here that could be really strongly green fringed, we see that that's not the case at all. Very neutral. Also, once again, I was impressed in this scenario. I compared this to a few other lenses. I was very impressed by the neutrality. This is a medium gray background and a light tint that I was using, and I got a variety of color values and color temperatures out of other lenses. This was the most accurate. Let's look at that again here in a scenario. I've been using this kind of chessboard recently because it can tell me a number of things about bokeh, about chromatic aberrations, contrast. So in this situation, you can tell that there is some backlighting. This is at f1.4, and so we can see that due to the bright kind of backlit conditions, and I was using very strong studio lights to light this, we can see that there are some hot spots here. And overall, contrast here is not mind-blowing on this subject. But the great news is as we move, towards the edges here, not hardly any green fringing there, and we move out of this towards where there are these circular highlights, we see that beyond the plane of focus that there are very little, very, very little chromatic aberrations. We can see that our highlights are nice and circular and soft without concentric rings or busyness. There's just a lot of very good stuff happening in this image. And so, that definitely gets a lot of pros from me. And if you look at the image globally, it's handled the rendering of this scene very, very well. If we move back just a little bit here, you can see that we have gained a little bit of contrast in this area, but here with a white piece, it shows off all of the fringing type issues. And as you can see, the amount of purple chromatic aberration that's there is basically almost undetectable. And so great handling of that here along this piece and then into these areas here. Very, very little green fringing and very nice bokeh rendering. And right off here towards edge of the frame, we can see a little bit of cat eye deformation of these bokeh circles, but for the most part, they're still pretty circular in nature. And so another positive, I would say there. Now moving out into a kind of a real world sunlit condition here, and this of course is a scene that has the potential for a lot of busyness, frankly, a lot of hard edges. And so what we can see is that I've gotten, if not at minimum focus, close to it. And so in this area where we've got focus, we've got nice detail that is there. But as we move out of the plane of focus, into this kind of transition zone here, instead of being ugly, that is pretty artistic. And one thing that this young company has done is that they have done a great job with bokeh rendering on their lenses, and the fact that they've managed to up the resolution on the 28mm, up the contrast, reduce chromatic aberrations while retaining this kind of rendering, to me is it's pretty impressive for such a new optical company. This also shows you what happens if you get close to minimum focus. Not always does detail hold up in this situation, but as you can see here, our contrast and our resolution, and this is a handheld result, is really quite impressive there. And so, you know, these kinds of images really spoke volumes to me. Here's a completely different kind of situation, f1.4, and so we can see obviously there's some very high contrast, some very dark areas, and some very bright areas. So first, let's take a look at this label, which was our point of focus. You can see nice resolution and contrast there. Once again, slightest bit on this highly reflective, high contrast area. Just a little bit of purple fringing, and after a little bit of green fringing. But all in all, both of those are handled quite well. Our bokeh quality over here looks good. And again, extremely bright, high contrast areas. And there's a little bit of green fringing there and a little bit of geometric weirdness due to the nature of some of the bokeh highlights here. But all in all, that's a pretty rich looking image. Colors are gorgeous on it. And so I'm impressed by that, again, in such an inexpensive optic. Now, just to give you a look at a few different kind of shooting scenarios, here is some street. I shot this in Washington, D.C., and so street is not necessarily my thing, but you know, I enjoy doing it when I'm in a city on these kind of occasions. And so you can see here, this looks to me about like f2.8. You can see that, you know, detail on the plane of focus is nice, and then defocus is handled nice. There's nothing kind of weird that are hard edges that grabs my attention there. And again, once again, color rendition is very nice. Here's another example, just a street musician who, by the way, was very good, blowing away on his trombone. And so, you know, kind of similar settings there. And I took the shot very quickly. We were coming up to a corner and waiting for the light to change. And so I only had a few seconds, but even though I don't know if my focus was 100% here, it's pretty close, like on his hand looks pretty good. And so I was able to quickly nab that. But overall, again, it's the look of the shot, colors. This has not been post-processed. That's out of camera, and again, it looks pretty good. Now, going to the other extreme of landscape, this is a handheld landscape image here, and so it was a quick shot because I was wanting to get down to a shooting location because the sun was just starting to rise. And as you can see, our detail going towards infinity is really quite good. I think I shot this at f5.6, and you can see off towards the edges of the frame, we've got good detail. Chromatic aberrations are not an issue. And, you know, across the frame, good detail, and of course, really nice color rendition. All I've done here is I've pulled up shadows just a little bit, pulled down highlights a little bit to equalize the histogram. But other than that, that's straight out of camera. And, you know, frankly, it's a pretty great result. Here, this was shot from a tripod, and it's actually part of a bracketed sequence. So I shot one bracketed sequence for highlights, exposure, highlights, shadows, you know, and then a medium exposure. And so this is actually the medium exposure that I just did a few quick tweaks with, because it's a little bit more representative. But here you can see in this scenario, we've got, with the sun right in the frame, we've got a little bit of ghosting there, but you can see it's handled all of this stuff quite well. Overall, our contrast is held up here. Now, at very wide apertures, there is some loss of contrast, some veiling that takes place. Here at f5.6 or f8, somewhere along in there, that contrast holds up quite well. Now, one thing to watch for is all I did here basically was recompose in a vertical orientation, but just the nature of how the composition went, you can see we did get more ghosting artifacts, and those ghosting artifacts and the other composition would have been out of the frame. And so once again, contrast is held up fine, but there is some ghosting effects. So, you know, I demonstrated that to show you that you watch how you compose and you get different kind of results. So there is some veiling, loss of contrast at wide aperture, stop down. Veiling is not a problem, but ghosting artifacts, if you're not careful, can become noticeable. But all in all, you know, once again, for shooting directly into the sun, it's not a bad result. So as you can see, other than some softness around the edges of the frame at very wide apertures, the optical performance of this lens is actually really strong. And on a number of metrics, it's actually a stronger performance than what my, you know, still very reasonably priced, but considerably more expensive Sigma 30mm f1.4 DN lens, which I'm filming with at the moment. On the note of filming, I do want to add that over the last, about 5-6 weeks, I've actually shot a number of my episodes on the A6500 with the Kamlan 28mm f1.4. Of course, I wasn't really revealing that that was what I was filming with, but I did note that during that time, I had a number of people that wrote to me and said, "Wow, the footage looks fantastic. What are you filming with?" And so in some cases I said, well, Sony A6500, and didn't clarify further than that. I also said Sony A6500 and a lens I'm not able to disclose in other instances. But the reality is that I've been filming most of my episodes with the A6500 since July of 2017. And so really the variable that had changed was using the Kamlan lens for filming. And so I say that to say this is a really great lens for video work because it has really excellent color accuracy. It also has very nice global rendering, very soft, nice out of focus rendering, as you can see from that. And really the only thing to look out for is that propensity for some veiling and ghosting if the sun is directly in the frame. Outside of that, there really isn't too much to complain about, particularly in such an inexpensive lens. And so, you know, the list of optical shortcomings is really pretty short. There is some softness at the edge of the frame at f1.4 and f2, and but the center of the frame, and actually a good portion of the frame, is actually really great even from wide open. Very nice contrast, quite low chromatic aberration, particularly for an f1.4 lens, and as you begin to stop down, it's actually very, very sharp from corner to corner. I also find that already with the two Kamlan lenses that I've reviewed, I've been very impressed with the quality of the bokeh and out of focus rendering for such inexpensive optics, and it seems like that part of the equation Kamlan has gotten down. And the fact that they've managed to maintain a really nice bokeh rendering while adding in more image punch, contrast, sharpness is impressive to me, and it shows, as I noted at the beginning of this episode, a growing maturation when it comes to lens design and lens production. Add that to the fact that there's a lot of improvements here when it comes to the actual build quality, and I think that they have got a formula for success as they move ahead. So certainly if you're looking for a budget prime option, I recommend, and of course if you don't mind manual focus, I recommend that you take a long look at this lens because it's got a lot going for it. And if you would like to see more from it, if you look in the description down below, I've got an image gallery going with a lot of different images that I've been adding for some time to it in a variety of different scenarios. And so you can take a look at that and you know, maybe get a little bit more inspiration from the image galleries. You can also, of course, follow me on social media or become one of my patrons. All of those links are down below. Sign up for my newsletter. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.